Good morning and welcome to the second installment in our history history presentation about Smith Chapel. And we're delighted that so many of you could be here this morning. Twyla and I will be discussing the second part, which covers the period 1890 to 1945. So I wanted to jump in because I'm going to cover the first part of that period, 1890 to 1920. Now, I wanted to have a little bit of overlap from where we started, where we ended last week, just as a reminder. And so I wanted to say that here is the picture of Mrs. Catherine Poole and her husband, and also her tombstone from right behind the church here. And Mary Poole and Mrs. Farr were instrumental in launching this church because they went by horse and buggy to see Mr. Jonah Cockrell, who owned this property. And they went to see if he would sell this little acre and a half for this church, which he ultimately agreed to do for the large sum of $52.50. And I think it's important for us to see pictures and understand the personalities of people, because even though now they're only just a tombstone, that really they were instrumental in making this church what it is today. And before we go on, I did want to say, I had a divine moment at home this morning as I was organizing some of the notes here for this presentation. A little piece of yellow paper floated out from somewhere. And at first I thought it was just a pesky little piece of note. But then I realized after I read it that I do think that perhaps God pushed away some papers and wanted me to say this today. And this is a little poem that's I wrote down many years ago, anonymous. I'm not sure who wrote it. Look forward and be hopeful. Look backward and be thankful. Look downward and be helpful. Look upward and be humble. The reason we are doing this series at the inspiration of Pastor Ho Kang was we want to look backward and be thankful for what we have. But there's more to it than that. We also want to look forward based on what we learn and be hopeful about the future of our church. So I wanted to share that today before we moved on. And I wanted to say that the planning for this church did not start when Mrs. Poole went off to see Mr. Cockrell. Instead, it started back in 1888. And the members of the residents in this area who had been using the Jefferson Schoolhouse, as well as the church over in Drainsville for their services in their Sunday school, started to talk about where they could build a church right here on Beach Mill Road. They talked about how they would raise the money and what would be the finances of running such a church, what the land purchase would be. So many of the women who were involved in Sunday school and church held festivals. They took up collections. As Twyla described last week, there was a mite society, which went out and raised $167, which was a lot of money in those days, as I'll mention later. And so the planning began in earnest. And Mary Bradford was the church treasurer at the Jefferson Schoolhouse, and she remained the treasurer for the new church as it started up. She's also buried in the back graveyard, and I hope people are here today when it's nicer weather might circulate through the graveyard and look for Mary Poole and Mary Bradford and other important people who made this such an important church. In any case, the money was raised. $52.50 was paid. The deed was dated April 1st, 1890. And after the deed was signed, they also purchased an additional half acre for a cemetery. Mr. D.D. Penroe drew up church plans. So someone actually had an architect type approach here. and the effort to build this church began. So I wanted to move ahead. We saw these pictures last week of Jesse Smith and his wife, Lucina Perry Smith. And they were instrumental part of the team that came up with this whole plan to build the church. I put their pictures here because Jesse Smith, who had moved here from New York State back in the 1850s, was a carpenter. And according to Teresa Parrish's History of the Church, he had already built several churches in upstate New York. So he had some experience with how to put a building like this together that was not just a house or a school. And that is no doubt part of his experience is what led the people in this area to ask him to be involved in building the church. So the cornerstone was laid in 1890, and time and labor and trees were all donated. People, men and women from other churches and denominations came by using their horses and wagons to help dig the foundation, to saw the trees into lumber. And this church was built for a total cost of $1,200, including the $52 for the land. Now, $1,200 in today's world seems like a pittance. But in fact, in 1890, most Americans earned less than $1,200 a year. And the average income was $360. So that gives you a notion of how important it was that they were able to raise such a large amount of money in those days. I've turned here to the Smith family farm just to give you a little bit of color of one of the members of this congregation. The Smith family farm is on Seneca Road, just about a mile from here. The house is still there, and here you see a picture of it. And on the right-hand side is a picture of someone we presume is Jesse Smith on his team of horses. This photograph is, both photographs are courtesy of the Virginia Room at the Fairfax Library. In addition to the Smith farm, we also recently came across the bell that used to call laborers in for lunch and dinner and other great announcements. And that bell is shown here on the left-hand side, left and right-hand side. It's actually in Great Falls in a home of one of the Smith family descendants. And recently the house was sold, and we had an opportunity to go and look at the bell and actually ring the bell. So we can't hear the voice of Jesse or Lucina Smith today. It was never recorded. We can't hear the sound of hammers being used to build this building. But we can hear a sound of 1890 because this bell was from that farmhouse and from that era. And I want to particularly thank my wife, Susan, who was involved in that transaction, was able to learn about this bell, which is still in Great Falls. So the church took 3 years to build the church. The church did not open till 1893, but on a sad note, I need to mention that in 1892, Jesse Smith's wife, Lucina, passed away. So Lucina, who she and her husband had put so much time and effort into building this new church, Lucina never saw the completed church. And she was buried in Herndon at the cemetery there. It's always been a question in the back of my mind, why weren't the Smiths buried at Smith Chapel? But of course, in 1892, there was no church here yet. There was no cemetery. So they were buried. And later, when, as we'll learn that when Jesse died years later, he was interred next to his wife down in Herndon, not at the church that bears his own name. So the beginning of the church, here is a beautiful watercolor of Smith Chapel as it has looked over the ages. And on the right-hand side is a Bible, which stands actually behind me here, behind the pulpit. Mr. and Mrs. Henry Bishop donated this first Bible at the dedication in 1893. Mrs. Bishop taught Sunday school at the Jefferson Schoolhouse. Interestingly, Mr. Bishop later fought in the Spanish-American War, 1898. And both of them are buried right behind us in the cemetery. When we put flags on Memorial Day on those who served in the U.S. military, Mr. Bishop's is one of those graves that always receives a flag. At the dedication in 1893, quite a few local ministers came to honor this new church. And one of them, according to Teresa Parrish's report, wrote that it's appropriate to name this for Jesse Smith, who carried full responsibility of the building and who took part in bringing about this dream of a place of worship. The author of the report also said, "May this church always be known as Smith's Chapel Methodist Episcopal Church, as painted in the high peak." And if you look at the church picture on the left, you'll see that there is the half moon at the peak of the church, and that was installed at the time of dedication as well. So let's move on to some of the church was up and going. It was a real entity here. Let's talk about some of the early days, colorful early days. By the way, in 1895, 2 years after it was opened, a organ was purchased here for the church. A wagon and horses went to Georgetown and purchased an organ and brought it all the way out here. So there was organ music 2 years after the dedication. Some of the colorful stories that we wanted to mention from the parish report was, first one I'll mention is the 1896. There was a wedding to be held here, and the bride's younger sister was bringing her nieces and nephews in with a team of horses up Seneca Road, when suddenly out of the blue, a terrible hailstorm came, and hail the size of baseballs, it is recorded, pelted the people in the wagon because it had no roof, as well as the horses. And the horses began to buck and run on Seneca Road, and it could have been a fatal crash if some people hadn't stepped out from the general store that used to be over here at the corner and grabbed the horses and calmed them down so that the bridal party could actually come here and see the bride married. It's a story that lived on for decades, as you can imagine. In 1898, the pastor here was Reverend Robert Chu, and supposedly he would walk up and down the aisle while singing and waving his arms. And one time he stopped next to a young girl who was seated out here and said to her, "You sing like a nightingale." Well, that's not what the little girl heard. She went home and she said that the pastor had said she sang like an alligator. So you have to be careful, Pastor Ho, what you say here, because some people may hear different things in your preaching. In 1899, there were prayer meetings every Thursday night with an average attendance of about 12. Gives you some idea of how big this congregation has always been. And by 1901, Sunday school enrollment was 46, with an average of 24 during the year. By the way, the prayer meetings that were held by Reverend James Feltner, who was by then the minister here. And he said that many of the people came by horse, but many of them also walked. So this was the kind of community we lived in back in those days. I wanted to mention before going to that slide, I wanted to mention one thing that by the early 1900s, the land prices here in Great Falls had finally reached their pre-Civil War levels. So last week we mentioned how the Civil War devastated this area as Union and Confederate troops passed back and forth through Great Falls, taking horses and cattle, produce, burning up trees and fence posts. And while that seems like something that might be easily recoverable, in fact, the land prices here stagnated for almost 40 years, which gives you an idea of not only of the level of low incomes in this area, but to my point also that in 1890, they were able to still come up with the resources to build this church, despite the fact that they were living in an era of where their land prices were still below what they were in 1865. So moving on, I wanted to mention that there were two major changes in 1906 that affected this church as well as the greater community. First of all, Jesse Smith passed away at age of 88, and he was buried in Herndon next to his wife. So the man for whom this church was married passed from the scene. The man for whom this church was named passed from the scene. At the same time in 1906, the Old Dominion and the Great Falls and Old Dominion Railroad was put in from Georgetown to where Great Falls National Park is today. At the time, it was not a national park. It was a private amusement park where people get away from the city and enjoy the river and summer breezes. Nonetheless, this electric railroad transformed this area. At the bottom, you see the picture of the electric, one of its cars emblazoned on the sign with Great Falls and Old Dominion Railroad. And at the top, you see the trestle bridge, which goes over a difficult run on Old Dominion Road, Old Dominion Drive. And you can see that this was not an easy undertaking to put in this railroad when it had to span such major chasms as the difficult run valley there. So one of the investors in this was John McLean, and he was the owner of the Washington Post. And it's not surprising that one of the stops, well, there were many stops along the way, but one of them was called McLean. And of course, it still bears that name today for that investor. The reason that I mentioned that this railroad made such a big difference here is that for the first time, the local farmers here could take their produce to market in about 30 minutes once they got it to the railroad. And this opened a huge market of Washington, D.C., which they had generally been too far away to serve in the past. And the one thing that the people in Washington, D.C. needed that was available here was fresh milk. So many dairy farms were established. And in fact, at some point later, Fairfax County became one of the largest dairy producers in the state of Virginia. So that change was reflected by some of our neighbors. Here is the Knowles Dairy Farm barn and the Spalding Dairy Barn. The Knowles Dairy Farm was right over here. We could walk to it almost from here on Seneca Road. And the Spalding Dairy Farm barn was at the end of Seneca Road, a little too far to walk, but nonetheless nearby. And the Spaldings played a major role in this church over the years, as Twyla will mention later in today's program. And these large structures were built to have the silos to hold the grain, the barns to hold the dairy cattle and other supplies and tractors. This brought a new sense of prosperity to this area, including to the members of this church. So 1906 was a significant year for this congregation. So we wanted to just mention who were some of the church pillars over the years. And you'll see in the middle there that between 1903 and 1920, that there were ministers changed almost annually, that over those 28 years, there were 14 ministers, and a few of them served for as much as 5 years, but most of them served for 1 or 2 years. And you see the names of them. We're not going to talk about each minister at this point, But we did want to point out that in 1908, the minister here was Mr. A. Bitchell, and he is known in the report for having had a baby who was born while he was minister here, and the baby died. And the baby is buried in an unmarked grave behind the social hall. In 1912, another landmark was that the Sunday school enrollment had risen to 44. You remember earlier I said that it was 46 in 1901, and the average now is 34 instead of 24. So more people are coming to church and Sunday school. In 1915, Reverend Kerr, 1914 and 1915, Reverend Kerr was the minister here. And he and his wife organized the first Ladies' Aid Society, which paid a lot of the bills here and became a true pillar of making this a successful church. Interestingly, Mary Poole was elected president of that first Ladies' Aid Society. You remember Mary Poole's picture earlier I showed, because she is the lady who rode up on a horse and helped purchase this property. So she was a ball of fire, not only at the beginning, but here 25 years later, still playing a major role. And the Ladies' Aid Society addressed all of the church's financial needs. They kept up the parsonage. They contributed to its costs. They paid attention to this building and the upkeep of the grounds and any other financial needs that came along, which probably included buying hymnals and Bibles. To raise their money, the Ladies' Aid Society did things like saying that any eggs laid in a farm on Sundays, that those proceeds would go to the Ladies' Aid Society. They made quilts, which they sold around the community here. Reverend Kerr, who I mentioned just a minute ago, died in 1916 on his way to France. He was on his way to World War I, where he was to be a chaplain for the U.S. troops, and he perished on his way to France. Finally, to wrap up here, I just mentioned that in 1916, Reverend Bergerstock held revivals here, which Twyla will discuss in more detail later. And the purpose of the revivals was to, quote, wake up the spiritual ones who were asleep. And this became a popular part of the worship service here. Finally, I just mentioned that Andy Wilson is here today as the one of the founders of the Freedom Memorial. And at the Freedom Memorial in Great Falls, the names of those who have passed away serving their country are often read. And it's partially because when we believe that when we say the name of those who have passed away, it brings them back to life. So I'd like to read the names of the 5 boys who served from this congregation in World War I. And they were Worthy Schaefer, Joseph Thompson, Harold Jenkins, Paul Niswander, and William Beaver. All of them returned to Great Falls except Joseph Thompson, who died on his way back aboard a ship coming back from World War I. And so now I will turn to Twyla for part 2. Thank you very much.